Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. For those of you that I haven't met, I'm David Weiner, the Senior Trade Commissioner at the Canadian Consulate General in Atlanta. It's a real pleasure for us to be here sponsoring another Southern Automotive Conference, especially because the auto industry tops all trade Canada has with each of the 6 Southeast states we cover. I have the responsibility to promote international trade between Canada and 6 states in the Southeast: Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. And it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Flavio Volpe, who's President of Canada's Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, or APMA. The APMA represents the interests of automotive suppliers and parts producers, tool and die manufacturers, and service providers for 90% of independent parts production in Canada. The automotive industry is one of the largest manufacturing sectors in Canada. It accounts for 10% of manufacturing GDP. And in total, in 2018, it saw over $36 billion in part shipments to and from Canada. 136,000 Canadians are directly employed making automotive parts. This highly skilled workforce has an unmatched quality record with 25 J.D. Power Plant Quality Awards over the last 20 years. Those numbers may surprise people who aren't in the industry, but I'm sure that much of the audience is aware of the size of Canada's automotive manufacturing sector and its integration as part of the North American market. Odds are that one of your suppliers or customers is Canadian or is buying or selling to Canada. And if you aren't already doing business with Canada or a Canadian company, Flavio Volpe and I would be glad to introduce you to one of them. And speaking of Flavio, I'm really honored to have the opportunity to introduce Flavio. He is one of Canada's automotive leaders and had a key advisory role in the negotiations surrounding the USMCA's the successor agreement to NAFTA. If you follow trade publications, you've likely seen him quoted as he championed a renegotiation rather than a repeal of NAFTA. Mr. Volpe worked closely with senior officials in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico to help secure the increase in regional value content, which will strengthen the automotive sector in all 3 countries. Before he took on a role with the APMA, Mr. Volpe was Managing Director Canada of Bursol Solar AG, an international solar energy provider. And prior to that, he was the Chief of Staff to the Ontario Minister for Economic Development and Trade. Automotive parts are a key part of the Ontario economy, so he has many years of experience with the industry and an extensive knowledge of Canada's role in the North American automotive supply chain. So without any further delay, ladies and gentlemen, my pleasure to introduce Flavio Volpe.
Hi, everyone. I asked Dave to keep that brief because I wanted to come around and shake everybody's hand personally for my intro. Thanks for sticking around for this. I know I'm holding you up for the break after. I see some guys got the popcorn here. I promise that I eschewed all graphs and all lists, and we went with some funny pictures here. I thought, you know what, if I'm going to speak to 40 or 400 of you, I'm not sure how interesting Canada is. I know you're looking away when I said that, but I know. So I thought, let me do this with a few funny pictures. I'm great to be here across the street from PK Subban's office, the other famous guy from Toronto. I saw they won last night. Hopefully we have a better season this year than last. How do I intro Canada? So I thought, let me just take... Let's see what Wikipedia says about us. We're a country bordering a larger country. I think that's yours. But a lot of similarities, but overshadowed. So why am I talking about Canadian automotive? I'm not sure. Well, I'm sure you guys are all in the auto business. You know we make some cars. We do other things, mostly cartoonish things. I don't have a fancy Tennessee video here, but... other than maple syrup and the Canadian tuxedo, your full-body denim, I'll give you a few facts about Canada. We're a member of the G7. What does that mean, though? We've got the world's 10th largest economy, $1.7 trillion last year. We're also the world's 10th largest auto-producing country. The U.S. is number 2. And, you know, we're all going to be staring at at China's back lights for a while now. Canada's the 39th biggest country by population. U.S. is third. Canada's economy contributes about 2.8% to the world's economy. The U.S. 33%. We're 1/10 the size of the U.S., and some of those numbers kind of reflect those. So we've got to punch above our own weight. Luckily, our basketball team holds the 2019 NBA championship. We may have lost our best player, but I got shirts and hats I'm going to distribute after. We will gloat for a year. I don't care if we repeat or not. And we do own the Women's U.S. Open championship this year, and we're going to gloat about that. We'll take our opportunities where we get them. We've got to work harder to compete with the U.S. and other major nations, and I hope maybe I can show you that we are trying in automotive. Everybody likes to talk about AVs and EVs and CAVs and cars that'll fly you to the moon, and I'm going to talk about that because we do a whole lot of that in Canada. But we make the world's fastest car, which Chrysler tries to pretend is American, but it's designed by some guy who grew up in Montreal, and it's made just north of Toronto, and it's in one of the 10 OEM plants in Canada that employs 35,000 people. It's the first, Ontario's the first state in all of North America that had a mix of 3 U.S. OEMs and 2 Japanese OEMs. Kind of served us well when the world fell apart, and we kind of stayed in business there. Each one of our manufacturers has got a very significant operation there. The Honda plant is the lead plant for Civic. You'd think that would be in Japan, but instead it's in Canada. It's in Canada because Canada's got a trade agreement with Europe and a trade agreement with Japan with 12 countries, including Japan and TPP, and Honda wants to take advantage of that. The first place in the world that Toyota entrusted the Lexus brand was to Ontario. So we build, some of you driving around in RXs or NXs, we just added the NX to plants in Ontario. Chrysler makes the Hellcat twins. You want to get a Charger Hellcat, you want to get a Challenger Hellcat. If you snuck in line for a Demon, which I did, 3106, number 3106, you were able to buy the ballsiest American muscle car out of a plant in Canada. Ford's global lead for its CUVs is in Oakville for Edge, and GM's lead on its best-selling CUV is just outside of Toronto, about halfway between Toronto and Detroit, in Ingersoll. We make other things. Not that sexy, but they work. We make a lot of buses. If you go to Quebec, the French-speaking part of Canada, you want to get a bus order, I can make an introduction. Volvo makes buses there. Peterbilt trucks are made there. Bluebird makes buses. Lion. And if you want to get the old New Flyer buses, we've got heavy production in Manitoba. Okay, how long have we been making cars? Well, the first guy to give the speech flew down on his belly, landed on the skis, to announce that Ford was setting up a factory in Windsor to get around tariffs in 1904. Our auto industry goes back 115 years. It's the first international market for all of the U.S. OEMs, but also the first North American market for a couple of the major Japanese. Ford was making Model A's in 1904. General Motors up near Toronto, so about 250 miles up from Detroit, or 2 hours driving if you've got a Demon. A guy named Sam McLaughlin decided he was going to stop making horseless carriages because he got a good deal on engines from Buick and started making McLaughlin Buicks in 1908. So the two ends of the Canadian auto corridor have been in play for over 110 years. Chrysler's been in play in Canada since 1925. If you go to Windsor and you go to the assembly plant, the only place they make minivans in the world, that plant's been around since 1928. Honda arrived in 1986 in Alliston, and Honda used that plant to launch a lot of its new Acura product that's pointed down here in that plant. Suzuki showed up in 1986. Suzuki didn't make it through the global financial crisis, but General Motors took over that plant. And then Toyota showed up in 1988, and Toyota completely transformed the manufacturing landscape in Canada, both in terms of volume and approach in automotive and in other advanced sectors. We don't mess around. Led by Toyota, We've got a culture of quality. Yeah, I know everybody says that. We can make the same car with the same tools, training people in the same skill sets around the world. We don't really, quality doesn't work into our pro forma, our product decision matrix. I say to that, I don't believe you. I've been around that table with site selectors. More so than any other region, Canada continues to lead in assembly quality. J.D. Power has recognized that over the last 20 years, Canada, Ontario, has been awarded the most J.D. Power initial quality awards. In fact, as many as the next three combined, Kentucky, Michigan, and Ohio. In fact, we won 38% of the quality awards since its inception, but we've only got 14% of the production there. Why? Well, everybody, led by Toyota, is in the quality game there. We've got to compete on quality because I think we charge 3 or 4 times as much for energy up there as we do down here. Toyota's won 18 awards, General Motors 11, Ford, Honda, FCA have won. Everybody who makes cars in Canada, every single plant that's made cars in Canada has won this award. The Harbor Report that some of you guys use for easy reading, either going to bed or on the toilet, as you flip through it, you get to the ranking pages and you say, where are the Canadian plants ranked there? Well, General Motors has been dominating, General Motors Canada plants have been dominating the first spot on efficiency. The Ingersoll plant won 4 years in a row from 2012 to 2015, and then up the street in Oshawa, guys who have been in business there for 110 years, dominated the previous decade. Okay, it's a big place. It's kind of cold. You see Bobby here. He's got a beard. I got a beard. This is kind of year-round for men, women, and children in Canada. It gets comfortable, though. And then you kind of know when you're traveling across this country, this is even wider than this country here, that wherever you go, whether you go over here, over here, over here, over here, we're in the car business. Over here, we're in the fuel cell business. Mercedes-Benz global lead for fuel cells is in a sleepy but fun little part of British Columbia. I don't know how many of you spent time in Vancouver. Actually, I should say how many of you have ever spent time in Vancouver when it wasn't raining. But pretty close to Vancouver, we've got a very good cluster for alternative fuels, a global leading cluster. Here, right in the middle, right over the American truck building heavy vehicle industries cluster, we've got one in Manitoba. Right over here, I know I put this here, but we're really talking about over here. In this little 250-kilometer corridor, we make 2 million cars. That's 93% of Canada's automotive market, tied right in there to Detroit. And out here, we've got an incredible cluster of machine learning, advanced tech, EV, battery technology. I spent the better part of the last 2 years going back and forth to Washington, hearing people tell me in Washington that I was from another country. And I said, I may be from another country, but I think I'm from the same market. This is the North American market, specifically Canada, U.S., are inextricably linked. The most integrated automotive supply market in the world, but also the most integrated retail market in the world. 17 million car sales, 2 million car sales, 2 million car sales a year for 21 million. The Canadian car sales are essentially right along this borderline here. The Canadian market is the U.S. market. The automotive sector led trade relations and liberalization between Canada and the U.S. In 1965, we signed the Auto Pact. Essentially, we said, you want to sell a bunch of cars here, you got to make the same amount and vice versa. Well, it kind of worked. We went and signed something called the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement in 1988, and that kind of worked. And then this country that decided to start developing and reforming south of you guys said, knocked on the door about 4 years later, and the American president called the Canadian Prime Minister and said, I'm going to do a deal with Mexico, either you're in or you're out. So we're in. And so in this great NAFTA market, that there's been a heck of a lot of debate over the last year or two about the benefit of it. It is the most integrated automotive market in the world. It imports 3 million more cars than it makes, and that's because this U.S. market here is the greatest pull market in the world, the highest disposable income of any customer base in the world. The Canadian auto sector is geared to selling cars to the U.S. and vice versa. Now, we struck a new NAFTA, And it is come on, that was funnier than that. I have one or two guy. That was pretty funny. I'm not that funny. I really worked on this one, okay? The USMCA. I spend a lot of time on the USMCA. If you want to have, if you really want a good use of 20 minutes of my time, ask me how I got into the White House. I Googled the switchboard is the short answer. We spent a lot of time debating this market and saying, how are we going to, I really did just Google the switchboard, and then I said, hey, no, never mind. I'll go into that another time. We spent a lot of time talking about this market, fighting with people we shouldn't have been fighting with, who were making proposals out of Washington that we're going to shoot the American parts sector in the foot and the American automotive market in the foot. And we managed over the last year and a half to do one of two things: either convince everybody that we make cars better together, or there was a shiny light and he went somewhere else, and now they're negotiating with Japan and said, and fighting with China and said, yeah, we'll get along with our friends. But importantly, in this new deal, for the first time ever in a trade agreement, regional value content went up. So what it means is if you want to sell a car to somebody in Nashville, if you're going to make it anywhere if you want to do it tariff-free, 75% of that content has to come from any one of the three countries. And then those parts, hey, by the way, forget about getting, subcomponents from countries outside of NAFTA. 60 to 75% of those have to come from one of the three countries. Oh, by the way, in those parts, if you're going to buy steel or you're going to buy aluminum, 70% of those have to come from those three countries. Oh, you want to pay people less than $16 an hour? Then 40% of the car that you make where you pay less than $16 an hour got to come from countries that pay more. What does that mean? I've been saying this up and down the highways for the last several months, is if you're a supplier, if you're an aggregate cluster of suppliers, you're going to get 25% more business at full transition of the USMCA. When's that going to happen? Washington is preoccupied with something else this week. I think that something else can go in a parallel track to USMCA. I think we're actually going to see Washington ratify USMCA before the year is out. Canada's in the middle of a pretty messy election. I know nobody cares about it down here, but over there it's a mess. We may have a new government, we may not, but we won't get around to ratifying it until we sit back again in January. What's important to those of us in this room who are paying attention is that the new rules then, instead of coming in January 1st, 2020, will start January 1st, 2021. I hope you guys don't spend too much time in Detroit, and when you do, I hope you do it in summer months. But I will note that Detroit is part of the Windsor metropolitan area, we like to say. Detroit is the northern half of the Windsor city area, right? Maybe that was clapping for something else. The Ambassador Bridge that connects the two is the busiest commercial crossing in North America. Of the 18 million cars made in North America, 7 million are made in that cluster around Detroit. 10 assembly plants on one side of that bridge, 28 on the other side of that bridge. R&D, all of the Detroit 3 are there, of course, but Toyota's technical center and its North American R&D center are in Ann Arbor. Little known fact about Windsor and Detroit is, I know Detlef, I know you love Motown music, I know really plays heavily in Germany. If you were a Motown artist in the 60s and 70s and you couldn't get radio play because all the pop acts were white in Detroit, you ran across, actually you went south into Canada to go and play it on CKLW AM radio in Windsor. And not only am I taking credit for the auto sector here, I think that Canada doesn't get enough play for launching Motown. The guy in Washington in the big house likes to talk about having the best words and the best people and the best friends. We have the best bridges. We got a bridge that takes 7,000 trucks every day and $1 billion in two-way freight every day between Windsor and Detroit. And only in Canada, really, actually only in Detroit, we decided that, okay, look, we're going to build a new bridge. Although somebody said to me, this is going to be a tourist destination like Golden Gate Bridge. I told them, Golden Gate Bridge is in California, so I think maybe some of the California traffic gets to Golden Gate, not the other way around. But we decided to build a new bridge. It's going to go up in 2023. It's going to open 2023. It was originally supposed to go up in 2016. It's named after the greatest shared hockey asset between Detroit, and Windsor, Gordie Howe. You got a pretty good Canadian hockey asset. You got a few of them, actually, that play across the street over here. Gordie Howe won 4 Stanley Cups for Detroit. Detroit likes to claim him. He's probably the second best Canadian hockey player ever. He tried to wait around for when this bridge was actually going to be built. He made it through 88 years, waiting for regulatory approvals. He passed away in 2016 when the bridge was supposed to be built. We're going to finish it in his honor. Who's in Canada? Everybody. All your friends. Okay, who are all your friends? Some of you have booths here. 1,400 parts facilities, 100,000 people that work in parts, $35 billion in shipments a year, machine tool die and molds, probably global top 3 cluster there. Top 6 OEM suppliers, global, and 9 of the top 10 are in Canada. Bosch, Denso, Magna, Continental, ZF, Aishin, Lear, Faurecia, Valeo, all operating in Canada, doing production, many of them doing research and development and engineering. Little known fact here, 6 of the top 10 in the world are Canadian, including Magna, who is North America's #1. They pay a lot of my bills, so I'm going to say I hope that I'm pushing for them for #1 in the world. Although they employ more people in this country than ours, but that's a whole other story. BlackBerry QNX. Listen, if you got a car right now, if you bought a car anytime in the last 10 years, you've got a BlackBerry operating system in there. It's a 50-50 chance. They've got about 51% of the world's OEM market. 150 million cars on the road are currently running software developed in Ottawa by QNX, which is a sub of BlackBerry, which used to own the market on smartphones until they made the critical decision to say, you know what, I don't think anybody's going to want them, and let Apple go and do it. But you know what? That company and all that Intel in there, all that capacity in there is now funneled into the auto sector. Westport Innovations and Ballard Power Systems, they've been leading alternative fuels for decades in BC. And then we've got suppliers in literally every single sub-component category in Canada. 95% of them in that little stretch between Windsor and Detroit. Really accessible for you the next time you take your family, sir, and vacation in the Detroit area. Canada's a top, well, I already said the part about molds and tools. Okay, we do R&D. Admittedly, a lot of that is cold weather testing. But, you know, we've got the native advantage there. General Motors and Toyota do cold weather testing in northern Ontario, and Ford does it in northern Manitoba, which you go to the top of Montana, and then you say, I'm going to take another 1,000-mile flight and go see the guys at Ford. All the OEMs, the 5 that manufacture it, plus Daimler, run major R&D centers in Canada. General Motors just hired, a couple years ago, 1,000 engineers in Ontario for connected and autonomous vehicles and urban mobility. Ford runs a R&D center for powertrain in Windsor that is a hemispherical R&D center, so they're not just doing this stuff in Canada, but if you have Ford of Brazil, it's testing engines. Jimmy Chong, who's about this tall, I think, is running 16 test cells in Windsor. Actually, the guy's about this big. He has a 1,200 horsepower Mustang. It is quite a sight to see. He should be up on the stage here. You remember him longer than you remember me. Honda has an environmental testing center in Nova Scotia. They like to pretend that's not about cold weather, but they do get some recycled hurricanes up there. And FCA's got R&D test center in Windsor. A lot of car geeks in Canada. Car geeks used to be, when I was growing up, you'd hot rod in your driveway. You'd probably ruin your father's driveway, or like mine, he didn't allow you to park the cars in that driveway. Car geeks now sit on both sides of the government and private sector in Canada. We've got Volkswagen partnering with a BC company to analyze data from 10,000 Beijing taxis to optimize travel time, and we've got Bosch invested in Waterloo for vehicle and Internet of Things security in cars and infrastructure. Universities and government-funded R&D agencies focused on auto innovation provide Car Geek Haven, not found elsewhere in North America. National Research Council, there's 20 research institutes in partnership with the private sector that's publicly funded. CanMet, National Labs for Metals, Materials, Clean Energy, Fuels. DMG and Fraunhofer do world-class motor vehicle test centers, and 5 universities with auto-specific programs, 4 in Ontario, 1 in Quebec. University of Waterloo, where the biggest recruiter in Waterloo's engineering school is Microsoft. They've got 120 auto-specific researchers to work with you. That's a pet project we got in Ontario. Partnered with the government, $160 million auto innovation network of 5 regional tech development centers and a 20-vehicle fleet where anybody who's got any supplier that's got products that are commercially ready that they want to feature to OEMs, come join our fleet. It's the first of its kind in North America, and our partners so far are Toyota, Honda, General Motors, and a small company called Karma. This is a play on words. I thought it was funny. The Canadians thought it was funny. We got Waymo in Canada. Ontario is the second largest IT cluster in North America. If you take the IT cluster map and you overlay it on the automotive manufacturing map, the only 2 places globally relevant clusters intersect are in Ontario. Doesn't mean it works, but it does mean the opportunity is present. And we're currently working on all those transitions. There's 200,000 people in the IT sector in almost 30,000 companies. Google's first play with an actual OEM vehicle and not the little jelly bean that runs around in Palo Alto is with FCA in Windsor. They bought 62,000 of these vans over the last 3 years, and together with Magna, I've been working on integrating them into the Waymo system. Ford set up a $500 million CAV research and engineering center in Ottawa to be close to QNX. Ontario, you could test autonomous vehicles on Ontario roads since 2016. No crashes yet. I guess that's not that funny. In Canada, the federal government invested $125 million into AI research centers in Toronto, Montreal, and Edmonton. The key point here is all these cars are going to start building and developing big amounts of data. And the winners of tomorrow are going to be decided by who can actually process it. Guess what? We could process it. Toronto is the AI capital of the world, but also Montreal and Vancouver are huge players as well. I'll throw you out some numbers. There's 650 AI startups in Canada, 210 are in Toronto. When Uber decided it needed to step it up from its autonomous vehicle program that famously in Detroit, Arizona, in Pittsburgh, Arizona, a few other places, they had a real high-profile crash in 2018. That's where you jump back to my reference to crashing on the last slide. They decided they're going to do this right. It's one thing to turn around and have a fantastic technology in a vehicle, but what are you going to do with the data that's in it? How are you going to have the vehicle learn its way through? They decided they were going to hire the world's top AI experts to design cars in Toronto. $150 million over 5 years just on people, 500 people. Raquel here, Urtasun, is a friend of mine. She leads it. She's a co-founder of the Vector Institute. The University of Toronto is point zero, ground zero for artificial intelligence research. The godfather of AI is a guy named Jeffrey Hinton there, and he leads the Google Brain team. And in Montreal, where Facebook and Microsoft, Facebook using machine learning, Facebook and Microsoft are working together with a guy named Joshua Bengio, who is I guess he's another godfather. He's a godfather of deep learning. In Edmonton, way out in Edmonton, where everybody's fully bearded because it's cold, I think it's probably 20 degrees in the summer, Google's out there. Why are they out there? Because Canada spends a lot of time thinking about what the next step is. Everybody thinks we're cutting down trees or pulling out oil. People who have a little bit more sophisticated understanding of our market, well, they make some cars and they make some airplanes. The reality is we're heavily invested in the data economy and in taking our advantages in IT and flipping them out. All right. None of that matters if your cars are emitting carbon. Greta Thunberg would probably be yelling at me for that slide with the Chrysler, with the Dodge Demon, but we're as heavily invested in zero emission capacity. We've got world-class battery-grade lithium deposits in Quebec and Ontario. Tesla, when it decided it needed to do a center of excellence working on energy density, decided to go out to Nova Scotia, where Honda was. The fuel cell cluster in BC is one of the global top 3 fuel cell clusters. Hydrogenics, an Ontario company, is the hydrogen partner for Hyundai. Magna and Ballard partner with many of the OEMs that are attending this conference. Electrovaya, a company in Mississauga that started off life as a as a contractor to NASA on the space shuttle program, somehow became the battery partner for FCA on their RAM program. And Quebec Hydro-Quebec and Propulsion Quebec heavily invested public funds in a couple of organizations with a lot of horsepower, are investing heavily in solid-state battery research and smart electric transport. I know what comes after me in this presentation, and I know that I'm holding you from it. But I'll say that we've got a lot of, I see my Canadians in the room here. They could put their hands up. David's going to hide over there, Detlef. Maybe you'll remember some of this. Maybe you won't. But if you do, find us. We'll make introductions to any and all of the people that I referenced in this presentation. If you're going to come visit us, come do it in the summer. If you come in the winter, I can't pick you up at the airport in the Demon. I will promise rides in the Demon for anybody who comes anytime between March and October. Thank you for your hospitality, and we'll see you on a break.